All right, okay, I think we'll make a start. So good evening and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our regulars. And if you're a first timer this week, welcome to you as well. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I will again be the MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Sarit Zehavi, who we will introduce formally in a moment. And of course, tonight's topic is all about Israel's northern borders. Our format will be almost as usual. We'll chat with Sarit for about 30 minutes or so, and then open up for questions from the audience. And if you haven't joined us before, the way to indicate that you want to ask a question is to raise your hand electronically. And you can do that by clicking on the participants or the reactions icon along the bottom. Just click the little hand. We get a message and then we'll put you in the list, and you can ask your question. The chat function is alive and well, and people are welcome to use it. All we do is ask that you do keep to tonight's topic. Now, just before we introduce Sarit, we want to play with you a very short video clip. It's only 90 seconds, and it's from ILTV, which is an Israeli news station. And this was only yesterday, and it very briefly discussed the dire situation in Lebanon, and that will lead us in nicely to tonight's discussion. So, David, if you can please play the video.
Moving on, Lebanon suffering from the worst economic collapse in the country's history, compounded by coronavirus, the explosion at the Beirut port last August, and what international experts are calling inadequate government action. Half the population now in poverty, as the value of Lebanon's currency falling by over 90% in the past 2 years alone. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz then now offering aid to the Lebanese, despite the technical state of hostilities between these two neighboring countries. Now, there are still no details as to what the aid might include, nor whether Lebanon would accept it. But taking to Twitter, Gantz is writing that, as an Israeli, a Jew, and a human being, his heart goes out to the hungry people of Lebanon. And Gantz adds that Israel is ready to act with assistance as it has in the past, while encouraging other countries to follow suit, especially as violence and protests are breaking out amid the breakdown in basic services in Lebanon, including massive shortages in electricity and fuel.
موجود هون ببيروت صرنا هلا نحن عم نعاني بهالفتره الازمه كثير كبيره عم تشد اكثر لقدام العالم بعد ما يعملوا حل سلمي انه يلاقوا له شيء شغله لا بالعكس كلياتنا عم نصف الطوابير مثل كانه نحن قوم حمير فمعلش يسامحوني من التعبير بعد شوي حركب جوانح وطير.
The World Bank now listing Lebanon as a, quote, fragility, conflict, and violence state, meaning concerns are mounting that the conditions may soon become so dire that they risk becoming, quote, systemic national failings with regional and potentially global effects.
Right, okay, so to get us started on this discussion, Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Sarit Zehavi, is the CEO and founder of Alma, a non-profit and independent research education centre specialising in Israel's security challenges on its northern border. She served for 15 years in the Israeli Defence Forces, specialising in military intelligence. Sarit holds an MA in Middle East Studies from Ben Gurion University. Now, Sarit has briefed hundreds of groups and forums, ranging from US senators, congressmen and women, politicians, senior journalists, and visiting VIP groups in Israel and overseas. She's written numerous position papers and updates focusing on Lebanon, Syria, and Israel's national security challenges. Tonight, we're pleased to have Sarit join us. So Sarit, welcome to Australia, at least via Zoom, and welcome to the Australian Jewish Association.
Thank you. I promised my daughter one day I will come to Australia and bring her a quota.
Well, you'll be very welcome. Okay, now, Sarit, one of your on your website, and I've put the link up on the chat group. It's the very top of the chat group. You actually presented the theory that Hezbollah is collapsing the Lebanese state with the intention of taking it over. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Well, in order to do so, I want to give some background and, to say a few words about this crisis. This economic crisis didn't start yesterday or not even a few months ago. Ever since I've been dealing with Lebanon 15 years ago, everybody were talking about economic crisis. Of course, it was highly intensified in the past 2 years while the Lebanese themselves went out to the streets, protesting on the lack of dollars and the inflation and the harsh economic situation. It deteriorated furthermore when you see budgeting the hours of electricity, when you see limitation of internet, when you see lack of medications, prices getting really high, 350% higher than they used to be when you speak about food and basic products. The Lebanese currency is now 15,000 to $1. And as you could see in the article, about 50% of the Lebanese are under the poverty line, which also makes it a very difficult situation when we speak about sovereignty, since the army itself is experiencing the same economic crisis as the whole country and doesn't have enough money to pay salaries and to provide food for the soldiers. On top of all of that, there is COVID. The Lebanese are facing another lockdown with the Indian version of COVID getting into Lebanon. All of that together, I don't have a clear proof that Hezbollah intentionally, or the Iranians, wanted to collapse Lebanon, and that's why we presented this as a theory. But what we can say for sure is that this situation brings us to the point that Hezbollah actually controls the system, controls the social systems, the economic systems, and somewhat also the political systems in the country. Since there is no functioning government, this economic crisis is accompanied by a political crisis. The Lebanese state doesn't exist in many aspects and cannot provide the needs of its population. While Hezbollah is there and providing a lot of needs to the population. Medical needs are very bold now when we speak about COVID, but of course, not only. Will Hezbollah take over Lebanon in general? Well, the answer is yes and no, meaning that I don't see any other player in Lebanon that can actually create sovereignty, that can actually, create a new government that is not corrupted and will take the control and will bring Lebanon back on the trail. I'm not sure that Hezbollah can actually control every territory in Lebanon, because there are places that the opposition to Hezbollah is strong. So I believe it will be some kind, again, and that's the evaluation. There are other evaluations. That's my evaluation. Hezbollah will take over most of Lebanon. Hezbollah will take over Shiite areas of Lebanon and will try not to get into fightings or civil war in areas where it cannot win, like Druze areas or Sunni areas, etc. But it is the strongest player in Lebanon, no doubt about that. And it is the one who earns mostly from this crisis.
So it's really a coup by stealth, isn't it? And I guess I'm just wondering, does Hezbollah, they must want to take over Lebanon. I mean, they could have probably done it earlier. Has anything changed that they're moving in this direction now?
No, I think that it's much more safer direction, because it's not deteriorating into civil war. It's without creating more opposition. It is with buying the support of their base, which is the Shiite base. It is while many Christians and Sunnis are leaving Lebanon because they are losing hope. So the demography in Lebanon is rapidly changing. This process started years ago and it is now intensified. So I think there are only benefits for Hezbollah in this kind of situation rather than just taking over in a brutal way.
And is what's happening actually changing the Sunni Shia balance of the country, or how is it? Is there anything changing, or is it just pretty much as it has been in the past?
It is changing since the civil war in the 70s that started 15 years. And due to American evaluations, about half of the population in Lebanon is Shiite. I believe the change continues because I hear, and I think the Lebanese Prime Minister also mentioned that the dream of the young Lebanese is to leave Lebanon. They don't want to stay. And that's why eventually you are left with those who support Hezbollah. Either they don't have a choice or they see the one they support getting stronger. So that's why definitely demography is an issue here.
And you mentioned the Lebanese Prime Minister. Well, what's likely to happen if this process continues and Hezbollah eventually takes control? Does that mean that whatever was the Lebanese government previously just disappears?
Yes, it already did.
So what, there's really no functioning government, no functioning Lebanese government at the moment?
No, you know, some Lebanese are saying that it's the state of Lebanon within the state of Hezbollah.
Right. And of course, Israel's watching this with great interest because of the Iranian influence. Is Israel just watching, or is Israel actually participating or trying to do anything to prevent this from happening?
I don't think we can prevent this from happening. The last time we tried to shape the politics of Lebanon in 1982, we paid a very high price. And I don't think anybody in Israel believes or intend to do it now. The only thing that we can do now is first being prepared. And I think that the Israeli army is working on that, not in light of the current crisis, but before. This is with the security level or aspect. When we speak about the strategic aspect, I think that new assumptions should be made in the Israeli government concerning any negotiations or connections with Lebanese government, such as the maritime border negotiations or all dialogue with UNIFIL. We need to make new assumptions. If you are talking about our defense minister offer to give assistance to the Lebanese, I think that Gantz himself assumes that the Lebanese would not accept any Israeli offer in public. And Gantz wanted to demonstrate a spirit of goodwill, which is nice, but nothing will come out of this. I'm not even sure that if Israel would offer secretly humanitarian aid, that the Lebanese will accept. This is a question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and just one final point on this, and then I'll hand over to David for a couple of questions. How does Islamic State factor into all of this? Are they with Hezbollah or are they opposing Hezbollah? It's a complicating factor, isn't it?
No, in this respect, it's pretty simple.
Okay.
There is no, in Lebanon, there is no cooperation between Islamic State and Hezbollah. Islamic State is Sunni, radical Sunnis. They consider Hezbollah as infidels, and that's why I don't see them cooperating in Lebanon. There is cooperation between Sunni groups in Lebanon, which are not Islamic State. Some of them can be some jihadi players. Most of them are Palestinian players, which are Sunnis as well. Hamas, including Hamas. We've seen this in the current escalation in Gaza. Rockets were fired from South Lebanon to Israel, not by Hezbollah, but by other Sunni Palestinian groups. This is the assumption, again, it's evaluation, that were probably nurtured by Iran. And we've seen a meeting of Nasrallah and the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, just last week in Beirut. So in this respect, yes, but it's not Islamic State.
Okay. All right, David, I think you've got a couple of questions for Sarit.
Yeah, Sarit, I'd like to ask you a couple of things about, from an Israeli security point of view. A few years ago, there were complaints or observations from some people living in northern Israel about noises, etc. And it was eventually discovered that Hezbollah was tunnelling under the border. So how significant has been the tunnelling? And from an outside observer, it seems like the complaints from those living in the north were ignored by the IDF and the government for quite a while. What's going on there?
No. The IDF didn't ignore these complaints.
Right.
Not everything can be discussed in the open. And what the IDF had done eventually was to choose the right timing operationally and in the sense of being well prepared with the intelligence and analysis of the terrain, and only then went to search for the tunnels, because you can assume if it's 6 tunnels along a border of more than 100 kilometers, this is what was found, you can assume how difficult it is to understand where exactly the tunnels are. And you're not going to search for the tunnels outside in an open operation that everybody can see you without being positive that you will actually find the tunnels. So that's why it took them time. So I can say, from a very personal point of view, nobody ignored what the residents of the North are saying. What's the importance of this? We managed to prevent a surprise in times of war. We will not be surprised by Hezbollah combatants in times of war, because we exposed their plans to enter Israel underground. Yet, I don't know if any of you visited the northern border of Israel. It is all hills and valleys and small trees. I don't want to say forested, but there are trees there that you can hide behind them. And Hezbollah is planning to send brigades to the border in order to attack Israeli communities and IDF positions along the borderline, with or without the tunnels.
The other security issue we've heard about over the last few years is the rocket stockpile that Hezbollah has reportedly accumulated, and some have made estimates anywhere from 100,000, 120,000, maybe even a few more. And of course, the latest development that we've heard about is trying to bring in precision guidance systems to make those rockets more lethal. How much of a threat is there in the Hezbollah arsenal? I mean, 100,000 is an enormous number of rockets if they decided to, launch an attack quickly.
So let's clarify things a little bit. Before I'll talk about the threat, let's understand what's out there. The numbers are of about 150,000 different kinds of artilleries. We in Alma Center published a report about the rocket array, but there are also UAVs, which I hope we'll discuss this in the future. What Hezbollah has done is positioning these rockets in populated areas in South Lebanon or in Beirut or in the Bekaa Valley, as you can see in the map, while taking in consideration the distances from the border, the ranges of these rockets, and the fact that Israel will have difficulties in, just destroying all these warehouses while they are positioned in civilian areas. You can see that these rockets are to various ranges, like in the second line of defense. Of course, the word defense is the term used by Hezbollah, which is in Beirut, includes rockets that can get to 200 kilometers and sometimes even more. In the main headquarters, you can find rockets here in Beirut that 300 kilometers, Litani River area, short-range rockets. Those are intimidated me in the Upper Galilee. If you can see my clicker, by the way, I'm here.
Yes,
in Western Galilee, about 11 kilometers from the Lebanese border. So when you look at that, you understand that this is a high-quality array with various kinds of rockets that are spread in a way that enables Hezbollah redundancy. If IDF will succeed in targeting some weapon depots, there are still others in other towns spread in South Lebanon, in various places in South Lebanon, in the Bekaa and Beirut. How do we, and know it before, how do we defend ourselves? Let's say one word about the ranges of these rockets. And I included here Hamas as well, because Hamas is also getting some help from Hezbollah. So this map, the map on the left, is the map that relates to Hezbollah, and you can see that it is covering almost all of Israel, yet most of Hezbollah's rockets are to the first two lines over here, which are to medium, what we call medium range, which is half of the country actually, and most of its population. Hamas goes up almost to Haifa in the north here, up almost a little bit north to Haifa in the north here. This is quite a problem with two aspects. First, the amounts. Hezbollah has the capability to launch salvos of rockets, many rockets at the same time, like Hamas did in the current escalation with Gaza, but more. If Hamas launched 50 rockets to Tel Aviv at the same time, and we've seen Iron Dome intercepting them, this time it will be, with Hezbollah, it will be much more. Defense systems of Israel includes various layers. I think the right word is layers, which is not only Iron Dome. There are different techniques. Iron Dome is one of them, and Iron Dome can intercept medium range, up to short and medium range artilleries, up to 300 kilometers. On top of that, you have also the David Sling, which can intercept to furthermore up to 700 kilometers, and you have also the Arrow and Patriot, each of them Arrow for long-range missiles such as the Scads, and Patriot for the UAVs. All of that together create dome that can protect us. And one more that I must emphasize, all of that together is activated by human beings, by soldiers, and not automatically, meaning that sometimes the soldiers has only a few seconds to decide whether to intercept the rocket or not. Right. Is this enough? It's never enough with these amounts of rockets. And as for the PGMs, Hezbollah, due to assessments, is holding around tens of PGMs, maybe even hundreds. We don't know exactly. I'm saying Alma Center. I guess that maybe IDF has a better knowledge. They didn't publish. But in the Alma Center, we don't know exactly. The problem with those accurate missiles is that Iron Dome cannot miss, because any miss can cause to a great damage. And this is the main problem. That's why the artillery threat to Israel is the main one.
Sarit, I guess the question really is, would all of this high-tech defensive equipment cope? Would it cope with an onslaught of rockets? Because we saw Hamas sending multiple rockets just recently, and I guess they were testing it out to see how Iron Dome would cope. What do you think? I mean, if there's double, triple coming in from the north, would all of this technology be completely useful?
There is no completely in war. There is no 100% in war. And even with the successful performance of Iron Dome in the current escalation, about 1,000 homes were damaged in Israel, and people had to evacuate to hotels. So there is no 100%, especially not when we speak about the northern border. And I think that all of us in Israel are aware of that. We know that we will have to be well prepared, not only with the interceptive systems, but also with shelters and alert systems.
Yeah, and the other question I have, it's one thing to have thousands and thousands of rockets, but Hezbollah needs to mobilize them. So does Israel look at this? Do they look at where the rockets are and how Hezbollah would mobilize them in the case that they wanted to do so?
Hezbollah doesn't need to mobilize the rockets to far distances. The rockets are very close to the launching areas. We in the Alma Center pointed out on 32 sites of missiles in Beirut. This is what we had found in open sources. Of course, there are many more elsewhere in Lebanon. And what we could see very clearly is that most of the sites we pointed at were launching sites, while these launching sites were kind of, I don't know, parking lots or very small open areas inside a very dense populated areas, meaning that the rockets are probably hidden in the buildings around the small open area. And that way you just need to bring them or to maneuver them to a few meters away from the depot and then launch them. This shouldn't be a problem for Hezbollah.
And the other thing we don't hear much about is the sea, the navy, and any conflict that might happen in the waters. I think Hezbollah's got surface-to-sea missiles, but we don't hear much about that. What can you tell us about that?
Hezbollah has two kinds of surface-to-sea missile. One it already used during the war in 2006, which is the C-802, and succeeded in killing Israeli Navy soldiers back then because the ship was not prepared to this kind of scenario. The second kind of missile is Yahunt, which has a higher, it's of course Russian technology, and it has higher distance to about 300 kilometers. It's a problem not only to the Navy ships, by the way, but also to the gas rigs and other Israeli strategic assets in the sea. Again, the defensive systems, I guess, will be prepared to intercept this kind of missiles, but there is no one 100%.
I think I know the answer to my next question, but I'll ask you anyway. Has any of the world bodies criticised Hezbollah for storing missiles in civilian areas?
Did you see what was happening in Gaza last month?
Of course.
Did anybody criticize the world or Hamas for launching from civilian areas and endangering the Gazians themselves and killing Gazians themselves with almost a third of the rockets that fell in Gaza because they are self-manufactured? Does anybody understand that Hamas and Hezbollah are deliberately endangering their own people doing so? I don't know. I'm not sure.
So it sounds to me as if what might come from the north is similar to what's been happening in the south, but just on a bigger scale. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yes, I always say that Hamas are the students and Hezbollah are the teachers, and not vice versa.
Yeah.
It will be more intense, and we will have to be prepared for this over here in Israel. And part of the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is because I know that, and it's because I saw what was happening in the international arena during the operation in Gaza, and I know what will happen in Lebanon in the next war, because we will have to defend ourselves. One of the reporters that was interviewed, a foreign reporter from RT TV outlet in Russia, a Russian outlet in Arabic, that was interviewed by Israeli reporters, and she was asked, why don't you cover what is happening in Israel? Why is your cover so unbalanced? And she said, Israelis are not dying enough.
Yeah, well, that's
right. So the good news is that Israelis are not going to die enough. We would do everything we can to defend ourselves, and we would do everything we can to defend the Lebanese as well.
And do you consider the possibility of having a double attack from Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south? I imagine Israel would be preparing for such a thing?
Yes, IDF already made some trainings and exercise in the past few years, exactly training this scenario of two-front or maybe even three-front war. Somebody wrote here 4 fronts war. Yes.
It's all on the cards. Okay. If David, have you got any other questions? If not, we can open up to the audience.
So it's reaction to local development here. Australia, for a long time, has not fully prescribed Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation. It drew this distinction, as some other places did, between the external security organisation and the political arm. It's only a matter of weeks ago that, as a result of work that we've done and others, the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security has recommended to the Australian government that the entirety of Hezbollah should be proscribed as a terrorist organisation under Australian law. Is this significant, what countries around the world do, how they view Hezbollah, or is it just sort of, oh yeah, it's interesting but not particularly relevant?
If there is hope for Lebanon, this is the only hope. Because as long as the international world, whether it's Australia or elsewhere, do not designate the civilian wing of Hezbollah, it is enabling the military wing to exist. It is enabling Hezbollah to use the Lebanese as human shield, and it is enabling Hezbollah to take over Lebanon and actually push out the Lebanese government. Because what this civilian wing is doing is providing the population the services that the government do not provide. But it is actually creating dependency of the population in a terrorist organization and enables it to use it as human shields. This dependency is not only financial, it's also political and mental, because along with the assistance of this humanitarian aid to the population, there is a huge project of education and indoctrination. And the indoctrination in the case of Hezbollah is indoctrination of Islamic revolution values.
Okay. All right, let's go to the audience questions. I've got Saul, Leon, Ron, Morris, Anne and Dennis. So if you want to add your name to the list, just send me an indicator by clicking on the participants or the reactions button and raise your hand. So we'll start with you, Saul. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much indeed. Could I ask this? Now, you did say that Hezbollah does provide some services, but given the fact that it is itself responsible in large part for the mess that Lebanon is in, and the Lebanese must be able to see that, given the fact that Hezbollah probably had a hand in destroying their port, is it not very difficult also for Hezbollah then to come forward and say, we are your savior, even though they may have propaganda among children, etc., for them to show themselves as the savior of a population must be very difficult indeed, which means that Lebanon is just in a completely hopeless situation.
If you can repeat the question.
So Saul, what are you saying? Are you saying that because
that Hezbollah itself is part of the causing the mess?
It's part of the problem,
someone causing the mess, very hard for them to come forward as, we will save you from the mess.
So
yes, but this is our narrative. And this is the narrative of those who are against Hezbollah, that Hezbollah is the one who is causing the mess. But if you ask Shiites in South Lebanon, for example, that are provided with all their needs, everyday community lives, financial support, educational services, medical services by Hezbollah, and they never got these services from anybody else, such as the Lebanese government. For them, Hezbollah is the savior, and it's the others to be blamed. Moreover, everybody in Lebanon, including those who are against Hezbollah, know that corruption is not only by Hezbollah. Everybody are corrupted in the leadership of Lebanon, the Christians and the Sunnis and the Shiites, okay? And that's why in its own base, which again are the Shiites in South Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, Hezbollah is definitely the protector.
Yeah, I think it's probably not uncommon for a government to cause a problem and then tell everybody that they're fixing it. And we only have to look at us here in Victoria with COVID to understand what that's all about. That was just a little private thing, Sarit. Okay, Leon, please unmute yourself. I think Leon doesn't have a camera, but he'll ask his question.
Yes, good evening, Sarit. I have a double-barrel question. First, does Iran have significant military assets, Iranian assets, in Lebanon itself? And the second part is this. Given that Hezbollah is an ally, close ally, an arm of Iran, is it far-fetched to suggest that if Israel were to have a quiet word in the ear of the Iranian regime, that any attack by Hezbollah would be perceived by Israel as a casus belli against Iran itself? Iran might be restrained. Iran might restrain Hezbollah.
No, on the contrary. First, Hezbollah is not an ally of Iran. Hezbollah is an employee of Iran, and Iran is the boss. So if to your first question, whether Iran has military capabilities in Lebanon, the answer is yes. There is a name to it, which is Hezbollah. It doesn't have, you don't see IRGC brigades in Lebanon, and you don't see other militias of like what would you see in Syria in Lebanon, because they don't need to. They do have Hezbollah and a little bit of, as I've said, Palestinian players that they activated last May. Whether an attack by Hezbollah will be viewed in Israel as an attack by Iran, yes, but I don't think Israel would retaliate towards Iran, because we discussed the fronts here. I don't think we wish to have another front, which is Iran. It's enough to have Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and maybe even more. I think that our business with Iran itself could be the nuclear issues and what you see that is happening in the sea, for example. But if Hezbollah will attack Israel, Israel will retaliate against Hezbollah.
Yeah, okay. Ron, please unmute yourself.
You hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi, good evening, Sarit. By the way, just regarding your comment before, there was a major news item on our this evening about the suffering of the people of Lebanon, and the word Hezbollah was not mentioned once, not once. Anyhow, the question I would like to ask is this: do you think there's potential for France to play a role in elevating and saving Lebanon? French troops, for instance, are also involved in Northwest Africa. Could there be a potential, possibly with Israel, to do something in Lebanon, both countries together?
Look, I need to present different views here among experts to Lebanon. My view is a little bit more pessimistic. I think that the opportunity was lost. And I was among the optimists until a year ago. I wanted to see a prospect for Lebanon, but as things went in the past year or so, I see less and less prospect, which takes me to your question about France. The president of France, Macron, whenever he comes to Lebanon, he's talking very highly on the need to create a change and to, to help Lebanese, etc. But eventually he views Hezbollah as a legitimate, I can't say partner, but somebody to speak with. He says that Hezbollah represents a sector in the Lebanese society, and that's why it is important to dialogue with Hezbollah as well. But actually, when you are legitimating Hezbollah in this way, you are preventing the creation of any other player that may replace Hezbollah in the future. And as I've said, this situation creates what we are viewing now, the fact that Hezbollah is becoming the strongest player in Lebanon, and nothing can move forward without the concession of Hezbollah. And while the international community demands to minimize or to decrease the power of Hezbollah and to disarm Hezbollah, it doesn't go well together, So I actually don't know how France can solve the problem. And by the way, the humanitarian assistance that got into Lebanon after the blast, we are now working on an accurate report about that, but with the sporadic updates that I've seen, some of this, at least some of this assistance didn't went to the Lebanese. It was, eventually exported elsewhere of Lebanon. Somebody made a lot of money out of this. It went to the Lebanese army, it went to corruptive businessmen, but it didn't went to the Lebanese.
Okay, thanks for that. Morris, I believe you might know Sarit, so say hello and ask your question.
I do. Shalom, Sarit. How are you?
Hi, Morris. How are you?
Sarit, just getting away from Hezbollah and Lebanon. I hope I'm not stepping over the line here. Please tell us a little bit about your Alma Center, what you do, and I believe you've got a simulation room that I think I'm looking forward to coming up and seeing.
Well, I established Alma Center 4 years ago because I felt that people don't have enough information about what we are facing here in the northern border. And the story that is being told about Israel's security and the Middle East stability is a story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is important, but I'm not sure it's the conflict, and I'm not sure that people understand that what is happening in the Middle East don't always relate to Israel. There is a lot going on here in the Middle East, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, that has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And many people are losing their lives and homes in these other conflicts. So that's why it was important for me to provide information and analysis about that. And that's why Alma is a research and education center, because we thought of various ways of exposure and education and engagement with the various audiences, whether it's students or policy and opinion makers. And that's why we designed here a situation room that looks like kind of a war room with all screens and maps on the wall. And the groups that are coming, and I'm so happy to tell you that we had a group today of young Americans. Finally, after a year and a half of COVID, that had a simulation. It's a simulation of a security crisis situation in the northern border, very, very similar to what we just experienced in Gaza. While the dilemmas are concerning issues of whether to take the risk of war in order to make the attendees understand that when Israel is at war, rockets are falling outside of the window. And the second dilemma, it's all about collateral damage and the issues we just discussed, that the international community don't fully understand why is there collateral damage in Gaza or in Lebanon, doesn't matter, the idea is the same. The attendees are becoming the Israeli government, and they need to press the red button. They need to decide whether to attack or not to attack. And when they are becoming the Israeli government, it feels like they get it. They understand. And we don't, it's not an escape room, so there is no right or wrong answer. The idea is only to introduce them to our dilemmas, to our complexity, and to what is the challenge we are facing.
Okay, yes. Okay, Anne, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. And then we've got Dennis and Effie.
Thanks for your presentation, Sarit. Was there ever a time that Lebanon actually did function properly as a country at any point?
Excellent question. And you know, you touched on a very important issue, because when I discuss what is happening with my staff, and I'm getting phone calls today and yesterday to interview about Lebanon. And there is a dilemma whether what is happening now in Lebanon is more of the same of what was happening in Lebanon, almost, I don't know, 70s, maybe before that. There was always an economic and political crisis in Lebanon because of the diverse population of the country. And if you ask the head of the research department in Alma, he will tell you it's more of the same. Everything you see now already happened 2 years ago, a decade ago, 15 years ago, whatever. For me, I see things a little bit differently. I think it's a gradual process of escalation of the crisis. And that's why maybe we are now closer to a change, kind of a change in Lebanon. But both of us agree that we will not be able to put the finger whether the change is tomorrow morning or next week or next year. So to answer your question, Lebanon has always dealt with economic and mainly political issues because of the diverse society and the religious sectarial key in Lebanon that says that the head of parliament will always be Shiite, the president will always be Christian, the prime minister will always be Sunni, the parliament will be divided between Muslims and non-Muslims, and all of that create a lot of mess in the country. And yet there are kind of peaks along the way, and we are now experiencing, or the Lebanese are experiencing, a peak in this crisis.
Okay, Dennis, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, Sarit, and thank you very much. I am going to hark back now historically to the Lebanon War in the mid-1980s. At that particular time, there was a Christian element along, they were called the Phalangists, I think, along the border with, or part of the border with Lebanon and Israel. And they gave a lot of support to Israel because they were being impacted by incursions from the Muslims in the southern part of Lebanon. Do these people still exist? Are they still on the border? Are they potentially friends of Israel, or could they be swayed to be friends of Israel to assist either with spying activities or in some physical way in any future war between Israel and Hezbollah?
You said South Lebanon, you said Phalangas. Phalangas are still exist by name, the Lebanese forces, but they don't have the same military capability as Hezbollah. What we had in South Lebanon during the 80s and the 90s was the South Lebanese army that Israel has established. Most of it was composed of Christians, but I must say there were also non-Christians in this army, this small army. This army collapsed completely when Israel had withdrawn from Lebanon in May 2000. And many of them fled into Israel. Some stayed and suffered from interrogations of Hezbollah. Today, among us in Israel are living about 2,000 soldiers and officers of the South Lebanese army and their families that left in Israel and kind of, in a way, I'm saying in a way because it's not culturally, but in a way became Israelis. Their sons and daughters sometimes even serve in the Israeli army. If they can be partners in times of war, sporadically and locally, maybe it's an option. But to establish a new South Lebanese army, this would take time, which I don't believe IDF is interested in staying for a long time in South Lebanon. And demographically speaking, my assessment is that there are far less Christians in South Lebanon than they used to be.
Okay, thanks, Sarit. Now, I know Effie Jacobi's name because of his connection with Morris Klein, but we've never chatted. So welcome to the AJA, Effie. He's in Israel, and I believe he's a fantastic tour guide, according to Morris. So, Effie, please unmute yourself where you have. Fire away with your question.
Fine. No worries. Sarit, hi, good to see you on. Hey,
good
Jay.
to see you, Effie. Effie is also a good friend.
I'm coming up. Sarit, two quick questions. One, we know Iran has suffered heavily with the sanctions that are on them, and therefore some of their financial support to Hezbollah as a natural course of events has lessened because they don't have. What are the sources of income for Hezbollah today? Where are they getting funding from if it's not just from Iran? And two, how does it feel, or how did Alma feel and you feel getting hacked by Hezbollah, giving you credibility by actually naming your center? Now, this is absolutely stunning for it to happen. So the floor is yours. How did it feel?
Okay, financially, first, unfortunately, we don't have numbers. We don't know exactly the percentage of the support by Iran and the percentage of self-finance in the budget of Hezbollah. There are evaluations that 1/3 of Hezbollah's budget is self-financed rather than by the Iranians. Maybe it became a little bit less thanks to the sanctions. Hezbollah, yet we can say very clearly that Hezbollah has been making quite a lot of money from drugs and crimes. We have more information about drug money. We are now working on a report that will map the routes of the drugs from Tehran to southern Syria and then to Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And of course, the income goes to Hezbollah. We already published a report about the king of Captagon, who is Lebanese Syrian or Syrian Lebanese, lives in the border between the two and provides poisoning actually the youth in Syria and elsewhere, merchandising with on Captagon and providing it outside of Lebanon, and that way a lot of the money, since he is a friend of Hezbollah, a lot of this money goes to himself, but also to Hezbollah. We know there is a lot of crime money and drug money that Hezbollah gains from its activity in Latin America, and we're going to have a webinar that will speak about the Shiite axis and Hezbollah global activities in France, in Latin America, and maybe even in Africa within 2 weeks. So drugs are important, Iran is important. Of course, there are problems, of course, and not everything is easy, but we don't see this when we speak about the military capability of Hezbollah. This was not damaged.
Okay, I've got Gary.
The second question about the attacks against Alma, let's put it this way. The moment you see a video that is signed by the resistance, which you know it's Hezbollah, that point the coordinations of Alma and, you know, with the same music we used against Hezbollah in our videos, now making a video about us and saying, this is Alma Center, this is where it's located, these are the coordinates, we are the resistance. So you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And then my son came and asked me, so what, we are in danger now? And I said, no, we are not in danger. Rockets will fall in the Western Galilee everywhere. So, you know, we have to be prepared for any scenario.
Yeah. Okay, Gary, Debbie, and then we'll see how we go for Reuven and Jeff. So Gary, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks for dropping in on us. We're locked up in Sydney, so it's great to have contact. Wondering about, curious about the beginnings of Hezbollah. From my rough understanding, 1982, Israel was sent back home, PLO was sent north. Shias were happy to see the end of PLO. Was Hezbollah installed by Iran, or was it linked with Iran at a later stage? How did it all? Yeah.
Excellent question. It depends who you ask. I try to understand, honestly. I try to understand. I read some analysis by various experts, because I didn't do a research about the beginning of Hezbollah myself, but I read some research in this topic, and I saw that there is actually a disagreement between the experts. Some are saying that it was a local initiative of the Lebanese themselves. Others are saying that it is clearly that the Syrians were involved, and yes, the year is 1982. And others are saying that right from the beginning, the Iranians took over. So, you know what, I can agree. What everybody share is that it doesn't matter who was the initiator. Bottom line is that the Iranians took over very, very quickly at the 80s, and that this is what made Hezbollah from a very small, unimportant militia to a militia that succeeded in carrying out terrorist attacks that killed tens of Israelis in Beirut, for example, or French soldiers or American soldiers over there.
Okay, Debbie, I think you might be the last, so apologies to Ruben and Jeff. So Debbie, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Sarit. A wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering, other countries in the world outside the region, I mean, I know that the people in the countries in the region, nobody can tell them what to do, but is there like some impact or some involvement or something? Like how do other countries in the world fit in?
Or do they just ignore everything?
Yeah. You're talking about Lebanon or elsewhere?
You're mute.
Yeah, in the whole region.
Look, how much time do you have? In the whole region, in each country, it's different. In each country, it's different, and in each country, there is different involvement of international players. In Syria, it is very clear. You see areas of influence by foreign players. In the north, it's Turkey. In the west, it's mainly Russia. In the south, it's mainly Iran. In the east-south, it's mainly United States. So it's really varies from a country to country. But the interests are the same. The Russians don't view the Iranians as an enemy, but as somebody you can collaborate with as long as it adapts your interests. We view the United States and Europe as allies. And I think that Lebanon is now in a situation that it is kind of dilemma to which direction to go.
Yeah, okay. Now we are coming up to time, so we're going to have to finish up in a moment. Sarit, I want to thank you for joining us. It's just been an amazing experience. You've got a wealth of knowledge and you presented very well. So Israel is very lucky to have you. So thank you for joining us tonight. Now, you've got a website, which I've put up a couple of times on the chat group. I imagine you're happy for people to visit the website and join your mailing list. What can they do?
There is a subscribe button in the website, so they can just put their emails and they will be part of our mailing list and they will get our weekly newsletter.
Okay, and in terms of funding, do you look for funding from the Jewish world? And I imagine that's part of it as well.
Yes, Alma is financed since COVID. Most of its budget is mainly from contributions from around the globe, and I would be grateful if you can be part of that in Australia. There is the donate button at the homepage of Alma's site.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarit. It's been a pleasure having you. Just before I hand back to David regarding next week, I will mention that you saw Morris ask his question. Now, Morris has started a new program called L'Chaim with Morris Klein. It's on Triple Z Radio in Melbourne, Australia. It's FM 92.3, or you can listen at 3ZZ.com.au, and it starts at 9 o'clock. So that's in a minute's time. And Morris's show this week will feature David Adler talking about our trip to Canberra, and also someone from Magen David Adom who's just been to Miami. So that sounds very interesting. So when we finish up in a moment, everybody can go and listen to Morris following us. Okay, I'll hand back to David, who will just give us a little bit of a wrap up for next week.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you also to Sarit for a very, very interesting discussion. I'll be very quick, just to show you that next week we have Rabbi Andrew Shaw as the guest. He's the CEO of Mizrahi in the United Kingdom. He's an exceptional speaker, very good from a religious Zionist perspective, as you might expect. And he will be addressing the question with us about certain categories within our community who seem to be turning against Israel, particularly the young leftists amongst the Jewish community, and his views on that and what we can do about it. And finally, and importantly, HAA also needs your support. If you're not yet on the email list, go to jewishassociation.org.au. where you can subscribe, like and follow the AJA Facebook page, which is now by far the largest Jewish forum in Australia. And of course, we also need financial support. So on the website, you can also apply for membership, make a donation, etc. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Sarit.
Okay, thanks, David. Sarit, thank you again, and we wish you much success. That's all from us for now. We do look forward to having you join us next week at the same time for what seems what will indeed be a very interesting presentation. So from me and the AJA, we wish you all a very good night. Bye for now.